To close yesterday's exchange, we heard from General C.Q. Brown Jr., the United States Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. To start our exchange this morning, we're honored to be joined by his British counterpart to discuss the future of Allied defenses. Please join me in welcoming Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, the UK's Chief of the Defence Staff. Admiral Sir Radakin will first deliver remarks, and then we'll stay for a brief fireside chat moderated by Thom Shanker, Director of the Project for Media and National Security at GW University and a longtime reporter at the New York Times. Admiral Sir Radakin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Julie and Stephanie. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here at the Ash Carter Exchange with such a varied and impressive audience. As you heard, I look forward to taking your questions after my comments. And I want to start by offering three perspectives from the UK. First, that the world is undeniably becoming much more dangerous. It has gone from being competitive to contested, and now, as we see from Iran's attack against Israel, it is increasingly combative. Second, reassurance. These are worrying times, but we're going to be all right. The international order is being tested, and the whole world is responding. And the strategic advantages of countries like Britain and America and our allies far outstrip those of our adversaries. And third, that the key to our response is confidence. We need to be realistic in acknowledging the scale and pace of the threats without falling into the trap of doom-mongering. Otherwise, we risk undermining the very things that keep us strong, our unity and cohesion, our faith in the values we share, our economic and technological ambition, and above all, our sense of self-belief. The past 6 months are among the most eventful and unsettling in global affairs since the end of the Cold War. And that's with none of the optimism or hope that came with the fall of the Berlin Wall. In Europe, we have a war with no end in sight. Last year's counteroffensive by Ukraine was less successful than we hoped. But we risk overlooking the huge cost it placed on Russia in blood and treasure. And it was the backdrop for an attempted coup in Russia and Putin being indicted for war crimes. We do have to acknowledge the Russian army was better entrenched than anticipated, and since then has been able to make modest tactical gains, albeit slowly and at even higher cost in men and material and to the national economy of Russia. In the Middle East, last October's barbaric attacks in Israel have, as we feared, served to inflame regional tensions. We've seen an outright attack by Iran against Israel involving hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones, Houthi attacks against Western shipping in the Red Sea, attacks on US forces in Iraq, and a sustained effort to delegitimize America and the Western presence in the region. And we've also seen a corresponding wave of division and protest across the world. Meanwhile, North Korea remains as belligerent as ever. China's posture is becoming even more assertive. Last week, it was the turn of the Philippines to be on the receiving end. Elsewhere, Venezuela has renewed its claims over huge swathes of Guyana. Kosovo and Serbia are at loggerheads. Georgia is rocked by protests. All around the world, long simmering tensions feel like they're coming to the boil. At the same time, many of these challenges are becoming increasingly blended and blurred. Whether it's the no-limits partnership between Putin and Xi, Russia's use of Iranian drones and North Korean ammunition in Ukraine, or the willingness of Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran to collude in subverting oil sanctions as the so-called axis of evasion. And then much more quietly, the architecture that governs our security is decaying as arms control treaties lapse, regional fora slip into abeyance, and hotlines that once spanned the divide fall silent. Of course, much of that just applies to the Euro-Atlantic. The Indo-Pacific never had any of these structures or frameworks in the first place, which in itself is reason for concern. But daunting as this may seem, we are going to be all right, which is my second message. The international order is being tested, but our national and collective interests are converging and spurring like-minded nations into action. That's certainly true for Britain. The reason Royal Air Force jets joined those of the United States, France, and others in defending Israel from last month's attack by Iran was to prevent the conflict with Hamas escalating to all-out war in the region. The reason the Royal Navy patrols the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait is because freedom of navigation matters to the prosperity of Europe every bit as much as it does to the Pacific. And the reason the British Army and its partners have trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers is because it is in all our interests to see Putin fail. It's not easy. The world is messy. The results aren't always apparent, and the task never ends, but it matters. And just as important as the military response is our broader approach, which embraces economics and diplomacy and links global security with our domestic prosperity. I've spoken recently about the return of statecraft. For the United Kingdom, this includes the security guarantees we extended to Finland and Sweden ahead of their joining NATO. It includes the Atlantic Declaration with the United States and the Hiroshima Accord with Japan. It includes the AUKUS agreement with Australia and America and our industrial partnership with Italy and Japan to build a sixth-generation fighter. Across the world, old partnerships are strengthening and new ones emerging. NATO is stepping up. Since the 2014 Wales Summit, defense spending by Europe and Canada has increased by more than $600 billion. Our NATO collective defense budgets are 3.5 times more than Russia and China combined. And we also have strength in depth. It includes intelligence agencies that were so effective in alerting us to Russia's intentions ahead of February 2022, and more recently of Iran's attack on Israel. It includes the industrial base across more than 50 nations that can mobilize to provide Ukraine with millions of rounds of ammunition, thousands of drones, hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles, and is now helping to build Ukraine an entirely new air force and navy. It's the cultural and diplomatic power that can be assembled in the face of aggression, exemplified by the role played by the likes of China, India, and Saudi Arabia in response to Putin's nuclear rhetoric in late 2022. And the biggest response was one that went almost unnoticed. As European countries sought to wean themselves off Russian gas, they were willing to subsidize consumers to the tune of 500 billion euros. We live in the richest quartile on the planet, and Western governments can leverage enormous collective power when they wish, which presents the greatest strategic advantage of all: choice. In the United Kingdom, on the back of an improving economic outlook, the government has chosen to invest 2.5% of our national wealth in defense. It means we can continue supporting Ukraine with the largest and most comprehensive package to date, £3 billion in total this year, and at least £2.5 billion for Ukraine each year that follows for as long as it takes. It means we can see through the modernization of our armed forces, renewing our nuclear deterrent, recapitalizing the British Army and rooting it in NATO as one of SACEUR's 2 strategic reserves, delivering the full potential of carrier strike, realizing the ambition of AUKUS. But it also means we can learn the lessons from the war in Ukraine and address our shortfalls, developing properly integrated air and missile defense, doubling our spend on munitions to deepen our stockpiles, resetting our supply chains to move from stop-start production to an industry that can deliver on a rapid and continual basis, getting after the challenges we face on recruitment and retention, and being much more ambitious with technology. That might mean long-range missiles for the British Army, laser weaponry for the Royal Navy, sixth-generation fighters for the RAF, or transforming from a force with hundreds of drones to one with thousands of drones. There is another shortfall that is necessary to address in these contested times: self-belief, which is my third and final point. We will shortly be commemorating the 80th anniversary of D-Day. This involved the young men who fought their way onto the beaches of Normandy and demonstrated enormous courage and a clear sense of purpose. They were to see through what General Eisenhower termed the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe and security for ourselves in a free world. In all the great conflicts of the 20th century, the West prevailed because we understood what was at stake. That was true in the Second World War. It was certainly true in the Cold War, and it is no less important a precondition for success in the 21st century. What we have seen unfold in the past few years is a battle of ideas between an authoritarian and belligerent Russia and a dynamic democratic Ukraine, between a reckless Iran and its terrorist network on one side and the responsible nations of the Middle East on the other, between a China that believes it can dominate and coerce and those nations that share a commitment to an international system that is open and free. We should be equally clear of what it is we are seeking to uphold: the belief that the rule of law is the basis of peace and prosperity in the world. This sovereignty is sacrosanct. Self-determination and self-defense go hand in hand, and aggression must not pay. That is what is at stake. The ceaseless flow of breaking news and instant commentary can feel overwhelming. But if you step up a level and take a strategic view, the outlook feels altogether more encouraging. Because as the history of the Second World War and the Cold War teaches us, success can rarely be gauged by a snapshot in time. It's the trajectory that matters. Our trajectory is one where NATO is getting stronger, growing from 30 members to 32. From just 3 members spending 2% of GDP on defense a decade ago to 18 meeting the total today and growing further. Meanwhile, Russia is on a downward trajectory, weaker and more isolated in the world and facing long-term social and economic decline. Putin's efforts to withhold Western gas supplies failed. His efforts to strangle Ukraine's economy failed. He's under pressure in Crimea. The Black Sea Fleet has scattered, and Russia has lost half the territory it took from Ukraine and now must twist its economy out of shape to sustain the war. And Ukraine today is more certain of its trajectory than ever before as a free and sovereign state on the path to EU and NATO membership and a rightful place in the community of democratic nations. In the Middle East, Iranian aggression is being met with international resolve. International aid is coming to Gaza. Trade is continuing to flow through the region. Arab and Western governments are still talking. Normalization remains on the table. In the Pacific, the tectonic plates are moving. Australia is stepping up. Japan and South Korea are recalibrating historic positions. Europe is engaged. India and the United States are moving closer to one another. This is how we respond to a more combative world, through statecraft, through even closer relationships, through a willingness to take military action when required, through inventing and embracing technology in a way that Ash Carter would have espoused, and by aligning the military instrument far more closely with our economic and diplomatic levers. And our greatest strength in the tasks that we face are the very things that we seek to preserve and protect. Our willingness to trade and cooperate with one another, the strength and connectivity of our economies, our unity and cohesion, and the resolve to uphold the rules and values we share. The task now is to stay strong, stick together, and see it through. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral. I cannot imagine a more thoughtful and thought-provoking way to start the day. I'm wide awake for one. In the few minutes that we have remaining, I've crowdsourced some questions. I'd like to drill into a few more specifics. I'd like to start with Ukraine, if I could, sir. The Kremlin recently announced that the Russian military will begin exercises for the use of tactical nuclear weapons. TAC nukes, extremely worrisome, but I would like your assessment, how we should thoughtfully assess that. How worried should we be? How much is messaging? And how much is a reality that Europe may face?
So, thank you, Thom. First of all, we should be really cautious about jumping to conclusions and going down this spiral of being worried. We've seen Russia's nuclear rhetoric before, particularly in the autumn or fall of 2022, and we've seen Russia make reckless nuclear comments, make ridiculous threats, and we need to rise above that, and we need to be really careful and not get bought into the rhetoric, and actually see what's happening. And what's happening is no particular changes to Russia's nuclear posture. No particular anxieties that flow from, once again, reckless nuclear rhetoric from Russia. Russia does not want a nuclear war. Russia does not want a war with NATO. And I come back to my point, we have to maintain our confidence and self-belief.
That's a very helpful answer. Thank you, Admiral. Looking at some of the specifics of the assistance to Ukraine, the large aid package finally passed Congress. Other NATO allies are jumping in. What is your assessment about how long it will take for this new flow of arms to have an impact in the battle space?
So I think we all welcome the US supplemental. The UK followed that with its largest package ever. Other nations are also leaning in. Some of that flows really, really quickly. It is ready to go, and it flows in a matter of days, and it can come onto the front line in the first week. But the full weight of that package takes much longer, so that's several months. But the real impact is about the confidence that it instills into Kyiv, into Ukraine's armed forces that are in the fight, that they're going to be backed, and they're continually being backed. And so it's not just the tactical impacts, it's the psychological impact and the deeper impacts. The piece that I think is almost even more significant is the number of countries that are saying that they will continue their support to Ukraine on a multi-year basis. That helps us with a weakness that we've had, which is that the industrial supply has been too limited, and that, right, understandably, industry has said they can't push through the changes to production levels and so on unless they have the assurance of multi-year contracts. We're overcoming that, And that then, I think, gives a lot more reassurance to Ukraine. And then at the tactical level, you're seeing Ukraine dig in to make life even more difficult for Russia. And we assess that Russia's going to continue to make modest tactical gains. And by that, again, it's just our being careful to step back and analyze what's going on. Bakhmut is about 9 kilometers by 9 kilometers, and it took Russia 9 months to take it. Advika is a bit smaller, and it took Russia 5 months. These are intense tactical battles, but they are tiny tactical gains. And then if you keep stepping back, you see a Crimea where Russia is under pressure and being attacked. Go back 18 months ago, and people were concerned about taking the fight to Crimea. Once again, the slightly mythical Russian red lines, which have been pushed through. Look at the Black Sea and Ukraine regaining its trade levels almost to pre-war conditions. That's where Russia is under pressure, and Russia is failing in all of its strategic objectives. So tactical intensity, tactical toing and froing, some initiative with Russia at the moment, and then we'll have to allow this deeper and longer impact by Western support to take effect over the next few months, and then that extends into next year and beyond.
Mm-hmm. You said in your very important speech that this is a war without a foreseeable end, but do you see for the foreseeable future this is a grinding meter by meter conflict, or will Ukraine be able to mount a meaningful counteroffensive with the flow of new weapons?
So I've always resisted putting out a kind of predicted timeline. I worry that that's a fool's errand. I dislike the meter by meter piece. I come back to the reality is that Putin has failed in all of his strategic objectives. He wanted to subjugate Ukraine. That's not going to happen. He wanted to weaken NATO. NATO's got stronger. He wanted to take at least 2/3 the territory of Ukraine. That's not going to happen. He wanted to take the capital, Kyiv. That's not going to happen. Russia is a more diminished power on the world stage. So the predicament for Russia is that it hasn't achieved its strategic objectives, which it wanted to achieve within days and weeks. And it's almost impossible to see how it can achieve those now. If you then come down a level, we see that Russia has adjusted its economy, has adjusted its mobilization, and that is giving it some strength at the operational level. It's also made those arrangements with the likes of Iran and North Korea to improve its ammunition supplies and to increase its numbers of drones. But then you're seeing at the tactical level, it's actually having very little effect. So some effect on land. But again, I come back to Russia is still trying to regain what it initially took on the high water mark of March 2022. It's still lost about half of what it gained in March. And even with the modest gains it's making now, it's still a long way off what it first achieved in March 22. And even that was inadequate. So the dilemma it's about the dilemma for Russia. How does Russia sustain this with a warped economy? How does it sustain losses of now 450,000 either killed or wounded? How does it sustain its predicament on the world stage where its trading ability is hampered? And it's those aspects and how they impact over time that then come all the way down to then also impact at the tactical level. And we're going to have to be much more patient to see how those unfold.
That's fascinating. I know that all of the nations supplying arms to Ukraine don't like to dictate battlefield policy, but help us understand, what is the UK's stance on how weapons you supply to Ukraine may be used, obviously on Ukrainian territory, but outside Ukraine on Russian targets?
Yeah, so the UK has always tried to be super disciplined about some of the other questions. Again, what is victory? When does this stop, and so on? And to acknowledge that much of this, well, all of this is for Ukraine to determine. And it's the same with the targeting. The UK has been really clear that it's Ukraine that decides the targets. We provide Storm Shadow missiles, and it's Ukraine that determines those targets, and we've been really clear that that stays within Russia. And then we've been really clear that Ukraine has its right to defend itself, and that Ukraine, it's a normality that with what Russia has done, with an illegal invasion of Ukraine, then the way that Russia is conducting itself with illegal strikes on civilians, the committing of war crimes, the manner in which Ukraine is being attacked allows it to defend itself, and Ukraine then has the right to choose to attack military targets in Russia. And I think it's a very normal policy, and it's one that the UK has been consistent with.
Thank you for that. In the 3 minutes left, you sketched out issues over the entire globe. So I do want to turn to another part of the world in my last question. I know that Asia is going to be the topic of an upcoming discussion, but you talked about the UK's vision for pivoting to Asia. Those of us who've covered national security in Washington for decades have seen the US pivot toward Asia so often that we're all dizzy. Yet we keep getting sucked back into this strategic cul-de-sac of the Middle East. Now this big catastrophic war in Europe. How will the UK make good on a pivot to Asia? And specifically, how will that be done with all of the other demands on your military?
Yeah, so thank you. So just to temper, it's not a catastrophic war in Europe. It's a catastrophic and terrible war for Ukraine.
For the Ukrainians as well.
But again, we've just got to be careful in this. Yeah, there's risk of inducing more and more anxiety all the way through. So the bedrock of the UK security policy and the way that we shape our armed forces remains NATO and the Euro-Atlantic, and we've got to be really clear on that. But the other piece that I like to reflect on with these conversations is a quote from Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, who makes the point that there's almost no such thing as regional stability these days. There's only global stability. And therefore, if you're a top 10 economy, you're a nuclear power, you're a member of the UN Security Council, you have certain responsibilities, and therefore you need to extend that to the other side of the world in the Indo-Pacific. And the UK is doing that, and it's not just in the military domain. It's using some of our existing infrastructure. We've got a base in Bahrain. We've got Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean. We're increasing our investment and facilities in Oman and in Kenya. We've got facilities in Singapore. We're in Brunei. We've got historic connections with Hong Kong. We've strengthened our relationship with Japan and with Australia and also with the Republic of Korea. And then you're seeing more exercises. So whether that's the British Army, whether that's our Royal Air Force, whether it's 2 patrol ships that we now have permanently in the region, and we might be looking to increase that in the future. And then we are exercising on a more regular basis and at a higher level. That's how we're doing it. But it's not just the UK. It's also that the major powers in Europe are all talking about Indo-Pacific strategies. And that's the piece that I think has changed in the last 5 years. And you're right about pivot sounds, you suddenly go like that. I think that we talked about a pivot in our integrated review in 2021. We've done that, and we've done it in economic terms as well as diplomatic and defense terms. And then we will keep that persistent presence up and look to strengthen that even further. But be honest about it's the Euro-Atlantic which remains our bedrock.
Thank you. Once again, this has been a thoughtful and thought-provoking way to start the morning. Admiral, thank you for your time, for sharing your wisdom, and thank you for your service to global security.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, so.